One case
Two interpretations.
and one question.
Beyond a reasonable doubt. Welcome to Two of a Crime.
Can one moment tell us the entire story? If you watch the body cam footage today, would you see the warning signs? Or are we seeing them because we already know how the story ends? Today, we're asking whether one interaction can tell us everything about a relationship or not. Let me tell you the story. So before she was in the headlines, before there were search parties, before millions of people knew her name, she was just Gabby. Gabby Petito was a young woman with a creative spirit and a love for adventure. She loved photography, documenting life's little moments, and finding the beauty in places she visited. Like so many people her age, she dreamed of building a life that felt meaningful, not just following a routine, but creating experiences she could share with people that she loved. In 2021, Gabby and her fiance, Brian Laundrie, set out on what they hoped would be the adventure of a lifetime. They converted a little white Ford Transit van into a tiny home on wheels, and they began traveling across the country, visiting national parks, hiking scenic trails, and capturing the journey beyond through their photos and videos. So they started like this YouTube channel. Gabby was especially excited to turn that dream into something bigger. She had started this YouTube channel called Nomadic Static, hoping to share their travels and inspire others to get out and explore the world. While the channel was just beginning, you can see how much joy she had just in creating, whether it was filming beautiful landscapes, editing videos, or photographing everyday moments that many of us just overlook. Beneath all of that was something even more important. She was a daughter who stayed close with her family. She regularly talked with her parents, and they were invested in her journey every step of the way. They encouraged her dreams, celebrated her adventures, and expected to hear from her as she traveled. To them, she wasn't an internet personality or a news story. She was simply Gabby. She was someone with plans, someone imagining where the next stop on the map might be, someone thinking about a future travels, future videos, all the places she still wanted to see. And at just 22 years old, it felt like her whole life was just beginning. And for a while, that's exactly what it looked like. She smiled in photographs. She explored some of the most beautiful places in the country. She was building memories that she hoped would last a lifetime. But somewhere along that journey, the story took a different turn. Okay, let's talk about the timeline. In July of 2021, Gabby Petito and her fiance, Brian Laundrie, left New York to begin cross-country road trip in a white Ford Transit van that they had converted to this van life. Their goal was to travel across the western United States while documenting their experience through social media and YouTube. Throughout July and early August, Gabby regularly shared photographs and updates from locations including Colorado, Utah, and other national parks. The couple appeared together in many of these posts as they continued their travels. On August 12, 2021, police in Moab, Utah, responded to multiple 911 callers that had reported seeing a man and a woman involved in a physical altercation. Officers located Gabby and Brian in their van and conducted separate interviews with each of them. After speaking with both individuals and assessing the situation, officers determined that there was insufficient evidence to support criminal charges. Brian spent the night in a local hotel arranged through a domestic violence resource program while Gabby remained in the van. The following days, the couple continued traveling. Additional photos and social media activity placed them in the western United States as they visited several national parks. Toward the end of August, communication with Gabby's family became less frequent, though. According to her family, the last confirmed verbal conversation with Gabby occurred on August 25th. Several text messages were later received from her phone, including one on August 30th, but investigators were unable to confirm that Gabby personally sent those messages. On September 1st, 2021, Brian Laundrie returned to his parents' home in Northport, Florida, during driving the van. Gabby was not with him. After several days without hearing from their daughter, Gabby's family reported her missing on September the 11th, 2021. Law enforcement agencies across multiple states began searching for Gabby while also working to establish her recent movements. On September 19th, search teams discovered human remains in the Bridger-Teton National Forest in Wyoming. The remains were later identified as Gabby Petito. An autopsy determined that Gabby's cause of death was manual strangulation. The forensic pathologist ruled her manner of death as homicide and estimated she had died approximately 3 to 4 weeks before the body was discovered. As investigators continued searching for answers, Brian Laundrie was reported missing by his family on September 17th. Although they later stated that they had last seen him several days earlier, law enforcement began a separate search in the Carlton Reserve in Florida. So on October 20th, 2021, Brian Laundrie's skeletal remains were located in the Myakkahatchee Creek Environment Park an area connected to the Carlton Reserve. Personal belongings found nearby included a backpack, a notebook, and other items. The medical examiner determined Brian had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. After the notebook was recovered and examined, the FBI reported that in it contained statements in which Brian claimed responsibility for Gabby's death. So let's talk about the forensic foundations, or how investigators build a case. So to understand how investigators build a case and why no single piece of evidence tells the story. Before we start opening evidence files, let's take a minute to talk about how investigations actually work. When most of us watch true crime, it's easy to think that investigators solve cases by finding one big piece of evidence, the DNA, the confession, security camera, smoking gun, essentially. But that's not how real investigations unfold. More often, they're built one piece at a time. Every piece of evidence answers a different question. Digital evidence helps the investigators understand where people were and when events happened. Witnesses describe what they personally observed. Behaviors can document what investigators saw during an interaction. Physical scenes preserve what was left behind, and forensic science answers specific scientific questions about the evidence itself. So none of those pieces actually tell the whole story. Each one provides another layer of context. Some pieces confirm each other. Some raise new questions, and sometimes one piece completely changes how the investigators understand another. That's why investigators don't rely on just one type of evidence. They compare it all, looking for where the evidence agrees, where it conflicts, and more important, where questions still remain. Think of it like putting a puzzle together. No single piece tells you what the finished picture looks like, but every piece helps reveal a little more. The challenge is knowing the difference between the pieces you actually have and the parts that your brain is filling in on its own. That's exactly what we're going to practice today. So as we move through each evidence, we don't want you to ask yourself what happened. I want you to ask yourself, what does this piece of evidence actually tell me? Because good investigations aren't built by collecting one perfect piece of evidence. They're built by carefully collecting and combining many different pieces before reaching a conclusion. Now that we've talked about how the investigators build a case, let's introduce this week's forensic lens, because how we evaluate the evidence can be just as important as the evidence itself. So, before we dive into the evidence, let's pause for just a minute. Every episode, I'm going to ask you to look at the case through a different forensic lens. Not because we're trying to change the opinion, just because I want the questions we ask to shape the answers that we find. So today's lens is going to be context before conclusions. As humans, we're wired to make quick judgments. We see a short video, we read a headline, we hear a witness, or we watch one police interaction, and almost instantly our brains begin filling the rest of the story. Sometimes those inferences are reasonable, sometimes they aren't. Investigators are trained to slow down that process. And instead of asking, what do I think happened, they ask, do I have enough context to support that conclusion? Every piece of evidence adds context. Some confirm what we already know, and some challenge it. Sometimes we raise entirely new questions, and sometimes it just reminds us how much we still don't know. So as we go through today's evidence, keep asking yourself one question. Do I have enough context to make this inference? Because the answer might challenge how you interpret everything that follows. Okay, so you ready to go and get into the evidence? Let's open our first evidence file. We're going to call it the digital trail. So one of the first things investigators begin reconstructing is movement. Where everyone was, when did they get there, what evidence can independently verify those movements. Unlike human memory, digital evidence often leaves behind a record. So whether that's photographs, cell phone records, GPS data, text messages, social media posts, credit card transactions, location history, each piece helps investigators build a more complex timeline, not by relying on what people remember, but by documenting what can be independently verified. So before the investigators ask what any of it means, they first ask a simple question. What can we verify? In this case, investigators compared photographs during the trip that were posted, social media activity, text messages, phone records, GPS information, financial transactions. Together, these records helped establish where Gabby and Brian traveled and when certain events occurred. Some pieces confirmed the timeline, others raised additional questions that the investigators would continue exploring. So let's pause. What do we actually know right now? We know where certain phones traveled. We know where certain photographs were taken. We know when the messages were sent. And we know certain locations that were visited. These are pieces of context that the digital evidence provides. But what doesn't this evidence tell us? It doesn't tell us who typed every message. It doesn't tell us what anyone was thinking. And it definitely doesn't explain motive. It doesn't tell us what happened between any of the two timestamps. So if you have one timestamp on a photo, another timestamp on the photo, you're seeing what they want you to see. You're not seeing everything that happened in between. So digital evidence provides valuable context, but it doesn't provide the complete context. That's why investigators never truly rely on digital evidence alone. They compare it with every other piece of evidence collected during the investigation. So let's connect this back to today's lesson. Every photo, every text message, every GPS location adds another piece of context, but none of those pieces by themselves tell the entire story. So investigators have to resist the temptation to reach a conclusion too quickly. So instead, they ask, do we have enough context to support this inference? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is not yet. And knowing the difference is one of the most important parts of the investigation. So this leads us to evidence file number 2, eyewitness accounts. So eyewitnesses provide investigators with firsthand observations of what they personally saw or heard. Their testimony adds valuable context, but every witness has its limitations. So in our second evidence file, eyewitness accounts, when investigators interview witnesses, they're not asking them to solve the case. They're asking them something very simple. Tell me what you personally observed. Every witness sees the world from a different, vague point of view. Some witnesses only see a few seconds. Some observe a longer interaction. Some notice details that others miss. That would be me. Each account adds another piece of context to the investigation that investigators can then compare those accounts with each other and then every piece of evidence to see how well they fit together. In this case, investigators interviewed several people who encountered Gabby and Brian during their trip. Some described arguments, others reported interactions between the couple. Several witnesses contacted law enforcement after observing behavior they believed should be reported. Each account became another piece of the investigative puzzle. So, what do we actually know from the eyewitness testimony then? We know that we know what each witness reported seeing or hearing. We know approximately when these observations occurred. And we can compare these multiple witness accounts to identify where they agree or where they differ. Those observations provide important context, but what do they not tell us? Okay. Witnesses can only describe the portion that they actually experienced. They can't tell investigators what happened before they arrived. They can't describe what happened after they left, and they can't tell what either person was thinking or feeling. So an eyewitness doesn't document an entire relationship. They document one experience within it, and that's valuable context, but it's still incomplete. So tying this back to context before conclusion, what we're going to say is every witness adds context. No single witness provides it all. Investigators don't ask, what conclusion can I draw from this witness? They ask, what context does this witness add? And then they compare it to the context of every other piece of evidence they've collected, because one witness may confirm another, one witness may contradict another, one witness may simply reveal another question that the investigators need to ask. But before they reach conclusions, they have to ask, do we have enough context to support this inference? So we've looked at where Gabby and Brian traveled and what independent witnesses reported seeing. Let's now talk about the behaviors investigators documented during the police stop and ask the same questions we've been asking. What did investigators actually observe, and what meaning, if any, should we assign to those observations? So, in our third evidence file, we're going to talk about observed behaviors. This is often where investigations become the most challenging. Not because behavior isn't important, but because behavior almost always requires interpretation. So, unlike a GPS location or a timestamp, behavior doesn't explain itself. A person may appear calm, another may appear emotional, one may avoid eye contact, someone may seem unusually talkative. Those are observations. What they mean is a separate question. That's why investigators begin with what can they objectively document versus considering what those observations might suggest. So, during this police stop in Moab, officers documented a number of observations. Gabby was visibly emotional and cried through much of the interaction. Brian appeared calmer and answered officers' questions. Both described an argument that had taken place earlier in the day. The officers also documented persons' statements, demeanors, and observations when they made the encounter. The observations became part of the investigative record. So, again, from these observations, what do we actually know? We know that Gabby appeared upset. Brian appeared calmer. We know that they both had described a disagreement. We know that officers documented what they personally observed. But these observations, while becoming part of the context, they don't tell us everything. So, what do they not tell us? They don't tell us what happened before officers arrived. They don't tell us what happened after the traffic stop ended. They don't tell us what either person was thinking, and they don't tell us whether this interaction reflected the relationship as a whole. Would you agree? So, behavior is evidence, but behavior rarely speaks for itself. It gains meaning only when investigators consider alongside everything else that they know. So, let's tie this back to our context before conclusions. This may be the clearest example that we're going to talk about today. So when we watch the Moab body camera footage, it's easy to feel like we've been given the whole story, but we haven't. We've been given important context, but not complete context. So investigators aren't going to ask, what conclusion should I draw from this interaction? They're going to ask, what context does this interaction provide? So one emotional response or one calm response doesn't automatically tell investigators everything about a person or about a relationship. It becomes a piece of a much larger investigative puzzle. Our responsibility isn't to ignore behavior, it's to evaluate it carefully, because observations are evidence, but the meaning we assign to those observations depend on the context surrounding them, and that's where interpretation begins. So, we've looked at digital evidence, the eyewitnesses, the behaviors that officers notated during this traffic stop. Let's turn to the actual physical evidence and explore what the investigators documented after Gabby was found. So, in our fourth evidence file, we're going to call this the scene. Investigators arrived at the scene. They're stepping into a moment that's already passed. Whatever happened has already happened. It's their job to not witness the event, but every photograph, measurement, item that's recovered, observation, these details need to be preserved so that the physical evidence is exactly as investigators find it, and that record becomes an essential part of the investigation. So, in this case, investigators documented the location where Gabby's remains were found in Wyoming. The scene was photographed, mapped, processed according to investigative procedures. Evidence was recovered from the area, carefully documented and collected. Each observation added another layer of context for investigators to consider. Okay? So let's pause. Again, let's ask, what do we actually know? We know where she was found. We know what investigators documented. We know what physical evidence was recovered. And we know that these observations helped investigators reconstruct part of the investigation, but what does the scene not tell us? It doesn't replay the events that actually occurred, right? So we don't know what actually happened. It doesn't show investigators every action that took place before they arrived. And it doesn't capture the conversations, decisions, interactions that led to that moment. So we're still left kind of interpreting what's happening. So the scene preserves details and evidence. It doesn't preserve the event. Investigators still have to place the evidence within the larger context of everything else that they've learned. So if we tie that back to our lens this week, which is context before conclusion, this is another example of why this matters. A scene provides incredibly important context, but it isn't the complete context. Investigators don't ask, can the scene tell me exactly what happened? Instead, they ask, what context does the scene provide and what context is still missing? The answer comes from combining physical scene with timeline, digital evidence, witness statements, behavioral observations, and forensic findings. Only then can investigators begin evaluating the evidence that may actually support their theory. Let's determine in our final evidence file, let's explore the forensic science that was able to help determine, and just as importantly, what questions it could answer. Let's turn to the forensic science. Unlike witness testimony, behavioral observations, forensic findings are based on physical examination of evidence. They help investigators answer questions using scientific methods rather than personal interpretation. But even forensic science has its limitations. Its purpose isn't to explain every part of the case. Its purpose is to answer the questions that science can answer. So, in this case, a forensic pathologist performed the autopsy. They examined Gabby's cause of death was manual strangulation. Her manner of death was ruled a homicide, and based on the condition of her remains, the forensic findings, the medical examiner examined that she died approximately 3 to 4 weeks before the body was discovered. These are critical parts of the investigation. Let me take it back to a case that we talked about previously. Remember in Casey Anthony's case, they couldn't determine or rule like a cause of death in Kaylee's case. Yeah, remember? So Casey ended up ultimately being acquitted, and there was no trial because Brian killed himself. But had there been, there was probably enough evidence, which ultimately maybe, I don't want to theorize, but maybe why he did that, because he knew he couldn't get out of it. So now we know Gabby's cause of death. We know her manner of death. We have an estimated post-mortem interval based on forensic examination. These are scientific conclusions supported by the available evidence. But what forensic science doesn't tell us is the conversations that took place, the explanation of decisions that were made, what either person was thinking. It doesn't answer questions about motive or intent. Those questions require investigators to consider forensic findings alongside every other piece of evidence in the case. So, the forensic science provides some of the strongest evidence for investigators, but even science provides context, not a complete context. So, just again, tying it back to context before conclusions, this may be the easiest place to assume that we have all the answers. After all, science feels definitive. And in many ways it is, but the autopsy tells investigators how she died. It helps estimate when she died. Those are incredibly important findings, but science doesn't explain every event that led up to her death. So investigators still have to ask, what context does the forensic evidence provide and what context is still missing? So when combining the forensic findings with digital evidence or the witness statements, the observed behaviors, the physical scene, and timeline, investigators can begin evaluating the conclusions and what the evidence actually supports. So science answers a lot of questions, but it doesn't answer every question. Recognizing the difference is just as important as understanding this background that science does provide. So good investigations don't ask forensic science to answer all the questions because it wasn't designed to do that. It allows science to contribute one of those important pieces to the investigation while recognizing that the other pieces of evidence have to be in there to support with context as well. So we've examined all the major categories of this case: digital evidence, witness accounts, observations of behavior, physical science, forensic findings. Before we discuss what all of it might mean, let's pause. If the investigation landed on your desk today, would you have enough context to develop a working theory? So, based on the evidence we've examined, do we have enough context to develop a working theory? A working theory is not a final conclusion. It's the explanation that best fits the evidence that we currently have available to us, while remaining open to changes as new evidence emerges. So, before we move into today's forensic interpretation gap, let's do something investigators have to do throughout the case. We've built a timeline, we've followed a digital trail, we've listened to eyewitnesses, examined observed behaviors, we've looked at the scene, and we've considered that forensic science, what everything was able to tell us. But do we have enough context to develop a theory? Not how does the story end, not have we heard it in documentaries, and not what do we already know happened. If this investigation landed in front of you, based on the evidence we discussed, where would the evidence be leaving you? Our current explanation, based on the context we've examined so far, this is where it becomes difficult for investigators. Because evidence doesn't arrive at its own interpretation, people provide that. And sometimes, without even realizing it, we begin to draw conclusions that reach beyond what the evidence alone can support. And that's where today's forensic interpretation gap begins. So, throughout today's episode, we've asked ourselves the same questions over and over again. Do we have enough context to reach a conclusion? Now it's time to ask a harder question. Did we actually do that? Or did we begin reaching conclusions before we had enough context? So let's go back and retrace. Think about the first time you watched the body cam footage. What was your first reaction? What story did your mind immediately begin telling you? Now ask yourself something even harder. Would that reaction have been the same if you hadn't watched that footage on August 13th of 2021, before anyone knew Gabby was missing, before they were in the headlines, before it was a nationwide search, before we knew how the story ended? Or did everything you learned afterwards change how you interpreted that first interaction you saw? That's one of the hardest parts of any investigation, I think, is once we know the ending, it's almost impossible to pretend that we don't. So every new piece of information changes the context surrounding the pieces that came before it. So think about what each evidence file actually gave us. The digital trail gave us where people traveled, when certain events occurred, but it didn't explain why. Eyewitnesses gave us the context about what they personally observed. They couldn't describe everything they didn't see. Observed behaviors gave us the context about one documented interaction. They didn't automatically explain the entire relationship. The crime scene preserved physical evidence. It didn't observe the event itself. And the forensic findings answered important scientific questions, but they couldn't answer every human one. Each piece of evidence added this context, but none of them standing alone told the whole story. And that's where the gap occurs. Evidence answers many questions, but our minds naturally want to answer those questions that remain and fill in these gaps that we have. So that's the forensic interpretation gap. It's the space in between what evidence establishes and the conclusions that we're tempted to reach. Sometimes these conclusions are strongly supported, and sometimes they're reasonable inferences. And sometimes they require assumptions that we may not even realize that we're making. Recognizing the difference isn't about avoiding conclusions, it's about understanding how we arrived at them. So good investigators don't stop and think once they have a theory, they keep testing it. They keep asking whether new evidence supports it, changes it, or challenges it. And that's what really our podcast is about. Not telling people what to think, helping all of us become more intentional about how we think. Because good investigations aren't built on quick conclusions. They're built on carefully evaluating the context, recognizing the limits of every piece of evidence, and remaining willing to adjust our thinking as new information emerges. That's how better investigators think and how better critical thinkers think as well. So as you leave today, don't just ask yourself what happened. Ask why. What evidence shaped your thinking? What questions still remained unanswered? And did you have enough context before reaching your conclusion? And then we'll continue to deliberate later this week on the page. So every piece of evidence adds context. Not one single piece of evidence tells the whole story. Our responsibility is recognizing where the evidence ends and where our interpretation begins.